which I have in Christ Jesus our Lord, I die daily. If from human motives I fought with wild beasts at Ephesus, what does it profit me? If the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. Become sober-minded as you ought, and stop sinning, for some have no knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame. 1 Corinthians 15:29-34. Some of you have started to get to know my family and I. My family is my wife Ronnie and I and our two boys, Eli and Theo, and we have a girl on the way in September as well. So we're very excited and also nervous and bracing ourselves for all the costs that incurs when you have a daughter growing up. But I want to talk to you for a minute about my oldest son, Elijah. So Elijah is 6. He will be 7 in November, and I have a couple pictures of him here. But Eli, one of the things that I have loved about Eli, getting to know him as he's grown up and getting to see his personality, is that it's made it clear, it's reminded me that life can be enjoyed for just the extremely simple things of life. As we get older, there are all sorts of things that we feel like we need and want in order to be happy. I need things to be exactly this way, and I need to have this and that and this. And with Eli, it is not like that at all. Eli likes some of the simplest things in life. He loves anything mechanical. So if you see a new car going by, he likes seeing the car. You see an excavator on the road, he's going to get very excited. When we go to Costco, he loves to see the forklift and the trash compactor. I'm telling you, this guy is easy to please. Loves mechanical things. But there's one thing that has captured Eli's heart more than any of these other mechanical things, and that is an elevator. Elevators. Eli loves elevators. He talks about them. He asks us if he can go see them. He likes to push the buttons. He likes to feel himself going up and down in the elevator. Bonus points if it's an elevator where you can see out the back of it, like at the Galleria. So Eli loves elevators, and he has from the time he was very little. He told us, and he would make us ride the elevator over and over again. And I have this memory of Eli where right around the time he turned 3, we took a trip to Disney World. So it was me and my wife and Eli, because he was the only child then, and my mom came with us. And we went to Disney World, and for those of you who know what a trip like this is like, you put a lot of planning and time into this kind of vacation. You want to make sure that you skip as many lines as you can. You want to do all the fun activities that you can. It takes energy and effort, and it's supposed to be this magical place for children. And I'll tell you, we went on this trip, and it was an extremely fun trip, and we worked hard at it. We were playing 3-on-1 defense with the adults and Eli. So we were trying to cater this trip to him to have him enjoy it. And we stayed in a hotel that was tall. It was a 16-story building, and so we would ride the elevator when we would go up and down in the hotel. But we spent this whole week, and we tried to do everything. We took him to see the characters. We took him on all the rides. We let him try new things. He got to eat all sorts of food. We saw fireworks. So we get to the end of this week of being at Disney, and we're exhausted. We're breathing hard as we get back home. But we were at the time where we were kind of decompressing on the trip and asking and evaluating, what was your favorite part of the trip? I don't know if your family does this. We ask each other, what was your favorite thing that happened? And so everyone was sharing, and we really wanted to know with Eli, what was your favorite thing? Was it one of the rides? Was it when you saw Mickey, who you love so much, or Goofy or Donald? He loved all these things. And so we were driving back, and Eli said, we asked him, Eli, what was your favorite thing on this whole trip? And he said, the hotel elevator. Can we go back there now? And I just remember thinking, we spent so much money and so much effort and so much energy into making this trip magical for this child, and his favorite thing was the elevator at the hotel. What are we even doing here? We could have gone to a public library and rode the elevator up and down. Instead, we went to Disney World. What are we doing? So I remember thinking that and being exasperated. And that love for elevators has not gone away. I'll tell you another story that bookends this, and this happened just a couple weeks ago. So my family and Eli and Theo, our younger boy, we are getting used to this campus of the church now. So I was at the Woodway campus for the first several years I was on staff. I've been at Cypress for the last 4 years. And my boys know these campuses, but they're getting to know the North Campus now. And one of the things that Eli loves about this campus is that there are 2 different buildings that have elevators in them. And so on most of these weeks when we go to church, after he goes to jump, we will ride the elevators before we go home. It's part of what we do. But a few weeks ago, we were walking through this room. So it was just me and Eli. Ronnie and Theo weren't here that night. We were walking through this room, and I was taking him to jump because I needed to preach. It was one of these nights we were walking out, and he asked me, he does this sometimes, he wants to project what's going forward into the future. And he said, am I going to jump now? I said, yes, you're going to jump. That's where we're going. And he said, are we going to ride the elevator? I said, yes, we're going to ride the elevator to go to jump. He said, okay, and what are we going to do after? So what I thought Eli was asking is, can I get back home quickly? Or what's going to happen after church is over? What he was really asking is, am I going to ride the elevator again after jump is over? So he asked me, what are we going to do after? And I said, well, Eli, I think we're just going to go home, right? We'll go home and you'll get to see Mom and Theo. And I was thinking that's what he wanted to hear. And then Eli goes, well, then what am I even doing here? And in Eli's mind, the reason that we're going through all this stuff is so he could get to the payoff of riding that elevator. That is the thing that he wants to do at the end of the night. Now, if you notice in the story, both me, when we were leaving Disney World, and then Eli, when we were at church that night, both came to this question, why are we even spinning our wheels and doing this if we're not getting the thing that we want to get in the first place? And I think all of us have had a time in our life, or maybe many, where we've asked that kind of question before, like, what are we even doing here? Why do we keep doing this over and over again? I'll give you maybe a couple examples of what this could look like. I have known some girls in my life that in order to get the guy that they like to ask them out, would take on the hobbies of the guy that they were interested in. Ladies, do any of you know what I'm talking about this? Like, you act like you were interested in something that maybe you were not interested in to put yourself in the peripheral vision of the guy that you like. I've had some ladies tell me that they've done this before. And if that happened, so say there was a guy you're interested in and you start to take on one of his hobbies, say disc golf, one of my hobbies, but you didn't really like it in the first place. Over time, if you could put all that energy and effort into playing disc golf, but if you do not draw the interest of the guy that you like, eventually you're going to say, what am I even doing here? Why am I doing this? I got to stop. I need to go back to doing normal people things and not playing disc golf. Maybe we'll take this a slightly other direction. Some of you have maybe seen a person in your life, let's, for this example again, say it's a girl, where there's a girl that has goals and dreams in her life that she wants to be married and have a family and have a healthy marriage and family and kids in the future. But you see her giving her a lot of herself, her time, her energy, her life to a guy who is never going to give her those things. Not a worthy husband, not a worthy father. And you might ask this girl, what are you even doing? Why are you giving all this effort into this guy? He's a total loser. Like, he's never going to give you the things that you need. Why are you even doing this? Well, this kind of exasperation and asking that question is what Paul has in mind in this little snippet of the passage. We read a passage a couple weeks ago where he did something similar to this, but he basically is saying in this passage, why are we doing all the things that we're doing if the resurrection was not real? Now, of course, the resurrection is indeed real, but we are going to see a few examples where Paul basically says, why would you even try to do these things if you don't believe that the dead will be resurrected? So let's start verse by verse. We'll start in verse 29, and we will read each part of what Paul is discussing here. Verse 29 says this, otherwise, what will those do who are baptized for the dead? If the dead are not raised at all, why then are they baptized for them? Okay, there are not many verses like this in the New Testament, but this is one where we don't know exactly what Paul was talking about. Surely the believers in the church in Corinth knew exactly what he meant when he was talking about the baptism for the dead. He doesn't give us any context clues, but I want to talk you through what he was intending to say with this verse, but then also what it could have meant. So apparently, there are people in the Corinthian church that are being baptized for the dead. That's the verbiage that he uses here. I want you to pick up on a couple parts of the verbiage. One is this. He talks about this as being people that are not him. He would say, why would those who get baptized for the dead do that if the resurrection didn't happen? Now, in the verses immediately after this, Paul changes the pronouns and starts saying, why would I experience this if the resurrection isn't real? So what we see here is that whatever this baptism for the dead Paul is talking about is not a thing that he himself is doing. It's something that the people in the church in Corinth are doing. But let's talk through possible things that this could mean when he says that they're being baptized for the dead. Here's the first. They could be doing a vicarious baptism for people who are unbelievers, meaning you would say, this person that I know was not a believer and they never were, but they died, but I'm going to get baptized on their behalf so they could receive the grace of God. Now, does that check out with anything else that the New Testament says about baptism or salvation? Obviously not. So clearly, that's not what Paul means here. He's not saying that he approves of people being baptized vicariously for the dead. The only contemporary group that I know does this are the Mormons. And the Mormons, I would say, not just I would very affirmatively say they are outside the bounds of Orthodox Christianity. So this is a thing that the New Testament doesn't say anything about this other than this one-off verse. So I think it's pretty clear Paul's not saying that we should be getting baptized for other dead people. So you can't, dunk your brother in the pool and say, I just baptized you for grandma. That doesn't work. What else could it mean? It could mean that people here were being baptized over the graves of the dead, specifically people being baptized over the graves of martyrs of the faith, meaning they're being baptized so that they might be in union with those who have given up their lives for the gospel. That could be what it means. It could also mean, I think this is probably the closest to what it might mean, the dead might be referring to the dying body of the person being baptized. So in the past, when our senior pastor who recently retired, Dr. Young, would do funerals, he would often say in the funeral, we are in the land of the dying, but the person who's passed is in the land of the living. What this could mean here is that someone being baptized in a body that's decaying, meaning you're baptized as the dead, are being baptized into a new life in the future. That could be what it means. It also could be this, and I think this is quite likely as well. This could be a practice that some in the church in Corinth were doing where they were being baptized, again vicariously, for a believer who died before they themselves could be baptized. In the ancient church, we often talk about baptism happening pretty quickly after this decision to follow the Lord. In some parts of the early church, it wouldn't always work this way. They would get baptized a little bit later. And so possibly they could be getting baptized for people who had not been baptized yet who were believers. The honest answer to this question, though, is we don't know exactly what the practice that Paul was referring to here is. We do know that he is talking about other people who are doing it, but we also do know the point of why he says it. He says, some of you are being baptized for the dead, whatever that means, and he says, why would you even do that if you don't believe in a resurrection from the dead in the first place? Why would you go through the trouble of doing that? What are we even doing here? Back to the question that I asked and my son Eli asked as well. I found a quote talking about this passage from a New Testament scholar named David Garland. He said this, part of the thing that Paul's getting at here is, if there is no resurrection of the dead, then baptism becomes a pointless rite that falsely represents something that will not happen. The truth is, with baptism is, we talk about baptism being a sign and a symbol of the inward work that God has done in our life. So we're buried with Christ unto death. We raised to walk in a new life. We are talking about what God has already done in our hearts, making us a new creation. But it also is anticipatory of the future where we will actually be raised just like Jesus was raised. Why would we even be spinning our wheels and doing something like baptism if we didn't believe that it represented something real that was going to happen in the future? That's what Paul is getting at in this passage. So if you have any specific questions or ideas about what Paul meant by baptized for the dead, don't come talk to me because I have no idea. Okay, so to our initial thought, what are we doing here? We baptize because the resurrection is real. That's the reason we do it. The reason we do things like even going into the Lord's Supper and remembering Jesus, we do that because of our future hope and that the resurrection is real, just as it was for Jesus, that it will be for us. Verses 30 and 31. Why are we also in danger every hour? I affirm, brethren, by boasting in you, which I have in Christ Jesus our Lord, I die daily. Paul says here, he points out clearly, that he was in danger every hour of his life. There was never a time that he was in the clear and that he didn't have the possibility of him being persecuted or hurt or attempted murdered to him. That was always something on the horizon. And he explains it this way, I die daily as a result. Paul was putting his life on the line for the church, and that's clear when we read through his missionary journeys and what the book of Acts tells us. He constantly was in danger, and he's again saying this, why would I even do that if I didn't believe that the resurrection was real? What are we even doing here? So the same thing is true for us. We have to be willing to put our lives on the line for the gospel because the resurrection is real. Now, we are not in the same contemporary cultural situation that the Apostle Paul was in. Your life is probably not in danger in the same way that Paul's was. But the truth is this, if you walk with Jesus, you are open at all times to be ridiculed, to be cast out. If you are in the wrong place or the right place at the wrong time, you can end up being harmed as well. And we have to be willing to do that because it's worth it. Because the resurrection is real, the hope of the future that God has for us is real enough that we have to be ready to put our lives on the line. Verse 32, Paul continues with this thought. If from human motives I fought with wild beasts at Ephesus, what does it profit me? So he says, if I had simply human motives, meaning I wanted to enlighten myself spiritually or I wanted to be viewed favorably by other people, why would I have fought with wild beasts in in Ephesus? Now, here's the question. Is Paul literally talking about fighting wild beasts? I don't believe that's true. I'll tell you a couple reasons why. But before that, I will say this. The point from this verse is that we boldly face opposition because the resurrection is real. We hit on this a moment ago. We are liable and likely to face opposition from the world if we are walking closely with the Lord, but it's worth it because the world isn't right when it opposes Christ. Jesus is going to be the center of all history when we are resurrected like he is. It's worth facing the opposition because the resurrection is real. Now, did Paul actually have to fight wild beasts? In ancient Rome, there were times that people would have to go into the arena and fight wild beasts. And when I say fight wild beasts, I mean they would get mauled by wild beasts. It was actually a form at times of entertainment in gladiatorial games in the ancient world. This, though, for a few reasons, I don't think Paul's speaking literally here. One is this. He was a Roman citizen. He had the right to appeal to Caesar. And in all likelihood, if a Roman citizen was going to be executed or punished, they usually would be punished in a more dignified way. They wouldn't be thrown to the beasts. In fact, typically, if it got so bad that they would get executed, typically a Roman citizen would probably get taken outside of the city, away from all the people, and beheaded. It would be viewed as a more honorable death, which church history tells us that actually is the way that Paul ended up being killed. So he was a Roman citizen, was not likely to be thrown to the wild beasts. The next one is this. He was still alive when he wrote this letter. If he got thrown into the wild beast, into the arena, he would not have survived it. That was not a thing where you actually get, it's not a fair fight when you go in there and you're fighting a cougar or something. He's going in there and he's going to be killed if that is the case. The next is this. Paul writes another letter to the Corinthians later. We call it 2 Corinthians, creatively enough. And in 2 Corinthians 11, Paul gives a long list of many of the things he encountered in serving for the gospel. So he talks about a lot of things. He talks about finding opposition from the Jews, finding opposition from false brethren, being punished, being stoned, being bit by a viper in a shipwreck. One of the things he does not mention is fighting wild beasts. I feel like that probably would have made the list. If he's trying to give impressive things that he'd been through, fighting wild beasts likely would have made the list. Again, in the book of Acts, when Luke, who meticulously went through early church history to tell us what happened, he didn't think it was worth saying that Paul fought wild beasts, if in fact he fought wild beasts. And the other thing is this. In the early church, there was a precedent for people talking about opposition from false brethren and opponents of the gospel by calling them wild beasts. There was a precedent for that. So likely what Paul was talking about here in Ephesus was that he encountered really extreme opposition from people that were acting as though they were wild beasts. Now, we know from the book of Acts that eventually in Ephesus, there actually was a riot started by a group of tradesmen that were angry at Paul. They started a riot in the city and fomenting rage and tried to kill Paul. So that could be what he's talking about. We think, though, that Paul was probably writing this letter from Ephesus. But the point is this. He's saying, I have encountered rabid, angry people frequently. And why would I do that if the resurrection wasn't real? Why would I put myself through that if I was just going to get some sort of small reward in this life? I do it because the resurrection is indeed real. So now let's get to the meat of the passage for you and I. He's given some rhetorical devices. Why would you get baptized for the dead if the resurrection isn't real? Why would we die daily if the resurrection isn't real? Why would we allow ourselves to be abused by people if the resurrection wasn't real? Now he goes on to tell the Corinthians how they need to change their behavior. He says this, if the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. Become sober-minded as you ought, and stop sinning, for some have no knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame. He says to them, if the resurrection isn't real, then what's the point of trying to discipline your life and the way that you live? You should just eat and drink and be merry in the moment, do whatever feels good, because there's nothing coming later. Now, obviously, Paul doesn't believe that, because he goes on to tell them, so don't be deceived, stop surrounding yourself with bad people, wake up, be sober-minded, and he says, have knowledge of God and stop sinning. Those are the things that he says. to his people. Now, Paul has a history in his letters of telling us how empty it is to live a life where you're just seeking after pleasure. Back in November, I actually preached a sermon to us from a passage where Paul says exactly this. I'm going to read that passage to you. It's in Philippians chapter 3, and Paul says this: "For many walk, of whom I often told you, and now tell you even weeping, that are enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their appetite, and whose glory is in their shame, who set their mind on earthly things." He says people who have their minds set on earthly things, meaning they're not looking forward to the resurrection, they do shameful acts, and they think that those acts are good. They glory in their shame. And the reason that they do that, he says in verse 19, their God is their appetite. Their God, the literal word there is their God is their belly. And it's kind of interesting, that word, koilios, in Greek, it means belly, but it also could mean an empty cavern that can't be filled. He says there are people who are living for today, doing whatever's going to feel good to them at the moment, seeking pleasure with their life, when the reality is, first of all, it leads you into acting shamefully, and it makes you live in a way that will never satisfy you. And one of the things I wonder often is, are we living as though our God is actually our appetites? What's going to make me feel good today? I'm going to do that. You know, I know what God wants for my life, but I'm just, you know what? I think God would want me to be happy instead. So I'm just going to do what is going to make me happy. A lot of us live that way, and the truth is that leads to emptiness, and it also is the sign of an immature believer. I kind of like, Paul is going through this argument in this passage, and he tells them, why would we do this if the resurrection is real? Why would we do that if the resurrection is real? He says, if it's not real, you should just do whatever you want. And then rhetorically, in verse 34, he slaps the Corinthians. He slaps them and says, sober up, wake up, come to your senses. Don't live this way. You need to be careful of who you're around. You need to be careful what you're thinking, and you certainly need to be careful what you're doing. If we're living in such a way that our life is entirely about our appetites, what are we even doing? What are we doing? My last point I want to make here is that we discipline our thinking and our actions because the resurrection is real. Why is it that we are called to live a life that is upright and is morally upright and is disciplined? The reason is not just because we're following a set of rules. The reason is that our bodies matter. Our life matters. There is a future for us, and we're not just spinning our wheels when we live a godly life. The thing that would be spinning your wheels is if you live a life pursuing pleasure, because it is never going to make you happy. There's a Greek historian named Plutarch, and I found a quote from him here. He wrote several very famous Greek histories, and one of them is called Greek Lives. But I found a quote where he's critiquing a movement called Epicureanism. And so Epicurus taught that the highest form of good in life is pleasure, which obviously is not true. But here's what Plutarch said about that. He said, "What remains is but an empty shadow and dream of that pleasure that hath now taken wing and is fled from them. And that serves but for fuel to foment their untamed desires. Nor indeed can the remembrance of past enjoyments afford them any real contentment at all." Plutarch says something obvious here. He says that if you live a life seeking pleasure, pleasure feels good for a moment. Thinking back to pleasure that you experienced in the past does not bring you enjoyment and satisfaction in the moment. In fact, all it does is make your hunger and desire for pleasure grow even more, so that to get the same sort of payoff in the future, you have to do more and more. Now that sounds like any sort of person who's ever experienced any sort of addiction in their life. That it starts good, it feels good in the moment, but it doesn't last long. You have to go back for more, and eventually it leads to destruction into emptiness. And I think Paul makes his case very clear here. If the resurrection is not real, then what are we doing? Why are you even pretending to live a godly and moral and upright life? Because you should just eat, drink, and be merry. But we also all know that just eating and drinking and trying to be merry isn't going to make you happy. So what is the answer? Paul says you need to wake up, sober up, and live a life that God is calling you to live. I see 3 quick ways that he says that in these last few verses. One of them is this: we need to have right thinking about who God is. He says, some have no knowledge of God. He's basically saying to the Corinthians, those of you who are denying the resurrection of the dead and are living in a materialistic, hedonistic, godless way, you're doing so because you don't really know God. I think one of the biggest challenges in the church is to get people to acknowledge that they need to love the Lord with their mind. Meaning, we need to apply the same effort into knowing about God and what he wants from us that we apply to other areas of our life. Maybe the same kind of effort that you apply to becoming excellent at your work. Maybe the same kind of effort that you apply to forming your fantasy football team at the end of this month. I hit too close to home with a couple of you there, I'm sorry. But the point is this, our thinking needs to be in line if we want to live a godly life. Another thing is that we need to have the right influences. He uses a quote from a Greek playwright here when he says, bad company corrupts good morals. Maybe your grandma or your mom told that to you when you were growing up, but it's so obviously true. The people that you surround yourself with are going to influence, and really, they're probably going to determine the type of character that you have. Who are you around? And then lastly, that leads to right action. He says, stop sinning. Stop living a shameful life. Here's the one thing I want to leave us with today, because we still have a few more things to talk about in this chapter about the resurrection. But when you examine your life and the way that you're living, do you find yourself making your decisions and the patterns of your life just based on what's going to make you feel good in the moment? If that's true, I want to ask you the same question that I asked Eli and that Eli asked me. What are you even doing? What are you doing with your time? Do you believe that God has plans for your future and that he's going to raise you the same way that he raised Christ? If you believe that, why are you doing the things that you're doing? What are you doing with your time and your energy? Why are you spinning your wheels? The Lord has called you to live an upright, good, and totally in line with him lifestyle. The reason he's called you to do that is because he has plans for your present and plans for your future in the far away. And so the question I would have for you to finish is this: do you know what you're doing, and why are you doing it?